Hello, my name's Dave. I'm one half of the Geeky Guys, along with Mr. P, for those of you who don't already know me. I just thought I'd come on today so we could take a bit of a retrospective look back at children's television from the 80s and 90s. A bit of a stroll down memory lane to look back at some of the shows that I grew up with. Certainly Mr. P would remember a lot of them, and probably many of the rest of you would have grown up with these shows, or at least have heard of them and heard good things about them from other people, from friends and family. I just kind of got to thinking earlier on, did a little bit of research, and I couldn't believe the amount of big names that were involved in a lot of these shows. And they were not all live action, a lot of them were cartoons, but some of these cartoons had massive budgets. They had people involved with them that would normally work on feature films in Hollywood, even on British films. They had so much talent in there. There's a lot of people that were in some of these shows that grew up years later, ended up being in massive film franchises and TV shows. People that wrote the music for some of these shows went on to make music for massive franchises of films and for big TV shows that we all know and love. And I just kind of came to the point of thinking that we really did have it good back in those days, in the 80s and 90s. Kids TV now, for preschool, it's kind of alright. I mean, I've got a 2-year-old niece, so I know all about the shows like Mr. Tumble, My Little Pony, Paw Patrol, In the Night Garden, Teletubbies, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, I've watched some of those shows with her, and they're okay if you want a bit of music and colours and shapes and dancing around, a bit of fun. It's great. But sort of, I do feel a bit sorry for the children that are sort of 5 and upwards now. There's not a lot to engage the brains that much. There's not a lot of quality, not a lot of great writing. People aren't going on about the amazing theme tunes from shows now, are they? So it's just a bit of a disappointment. I just thought in this podcast we'd go back and revisit some of them and actually talk about some of the big names that were involved in these shows. So until you actually look back, obviously at the time it was just a show you enjoyed and that was it. But when you actually look back on them now, you go, that's why it was good. That because that money was spent on it, because those people took a chance on it. It was probably a side note to their career a little bit, and they thought, it might be a bit silly, but I like the people that are involved with it. The scripts look good, so I'll do it, and it's amazing. So yeah, here's a few clips of some of the shows that I'm talking about and some of the ones that I'm going to be talking about in this podcast. So here we go.
Defender of the secrets of Castle Grayskull. This is Cringer, my fearless friend. Fabulous secret powers were revealed to me the day I held aloft my magic sword and said, "By the power of Grayskull!" Thundercats! This is a story about an ordinary teddy bear. When he was made, they found something wrong with him and threw him away like a piece of rubbish into an old dark storeroom. Then, from outer space, a spotty man brought him to life with his cosmic dust. He took him to a magic cloud, where Mother Nature gave him special powers. That bear became Super Ted.
Children of the sun, see your time has just begun. Searching for your ways,
Well, I hope you enjoyed those. Those are a few tracks that I selected that certainly reflected a few of the shows that I grew up with and really enjoyed in the 80s and 90s, and the ones that I think had decent quality in terms of the writing, the acting, the overall looks of the shows, and I think all of those kind of had a bit of an effect, probably semi-consciously, but over the national and probably international public as well. Certainly for kids that were growing up around that time when those shows were on. I've just done a little bit of research, and I've obviously got a little bit of knowledge myself about a few of these shows. I'd just like to go through a few facts that you might not be aware of. I mean, going back right to the beginning there of those tracks, we had He-Man. I mean, for a start, we had Alan Oppenheimer in that, which is he's a massive name in TV and film. He's done a load of stuff. I mean, if you go onto the internet, he's done loads of films and TV shows and a lot of things you will be aware of. But in that show, he did the voice of Man-at-Arms, he did the voice of Cringer, and he did the voice of Skeletor as well. I mean, that's an absolutely massive range. So it just shows you how talented that guy was, what a brilliant voice actor he was. Certainly anybody that would do voice acting would certainly know him well and would say how good he was. He was involved in a children's cartoon. You've got Shukai Levy, who did the music for He-Man. He also did the music for Mysterious Cities of Gold, and he kind of, after that, into sort of the mid and late 90s, he moved into films. And he's done a lot of music for films. Again, if you have a look on the internet, you'd be amazed at the amount of film work that he's done on really popular, really good films that you will have probably seen. Again, he was doing a bit of an obscure children's cartoon. They had a storyboard artist on He-Man called Gary Goldstein, and that's a name that you may be aware of. He's worked on a hell of a lot of shows as well. He's done a lot of stuff in the comic book universe, which is obviously massive now with DC and Marvel. He's been linked to that universe, so it just shows you the amount of talent that they had on the show. And if you just look at all the animators, there's loads and loads of them. They've all gone on to do bigger, sometimes better things, but they're just big, amazing, talented people that are involved with it. On Thundercats, again, if you go into that, the amount of writers, the amount of animators, the amount of storyboard artists, I mean, there's just so much effort that went into that show as well. And you just think now of the writers they have on shows, and they have a few in these writers' rooms, but I mean, they had like 10, 20, 30 writers sometimes that they'd have on these shows. I mean, the amount of talent and the amount of people that were allowed to do their thing and put their ideas into the mix is absolutely amazing. And you just don't get that on kids shows these days. I mean, you don't get it on TV, for God's sake, for a lot of the instances. So I mean, it just shows how great it was back then, how much talent we had, and how people were commissioned to put their ideas forward and do this stuff. I think now a lot of really good ideas are not commissioned. They don't get green lit. Half the time they don't even get to the editors and to the channel controllers, to the heads of department that need to even read these ideas. Half the time they don't get to see them, and it's such a shame. And kids' TV is certainly one area that has suffered very, very badly, I think, over the last 10 years, probably 10, 15 years minimum. We also had there Super Ted, and you look at the people that were involved with that. I mean, the person that narrated the show, Peter Hawkins, has done a hell of a lot of work since. I think he's even done work in Doctor Who. Going on in that same vein, you've got John Pertwee, who did the voice of Spotty in Super Ted. He was also Wurzel Gummidge, and he was also the Third Doctor in Doctor Who. And he'd done a lot of films, a lot of other TV as well. Massive name. Why did he do a children's TV programme? You know, he saw the talent that was involved with it. He saw the scripts, he saw it was generally a good idea and it'd have a positive effect on children. And I think that's a lot of the things we're actually seeing with these shows is that the writing and the people involved in them did have a positive effect on children and did teach them wrong or right. I mean, especially He-Man, with Adam doing his now famous moral speeches at the end and doing a massive thing about morality. I mean, people kind of take the mick out of it now, but he taught kids right and wrong at an early age, and the amount of kids that we're seeing and young people these days that don't respect their elders, they can't speak the English language very well, every second word is foul language or a blue word. You didn't have that quite so much when Adam of Eternia was in control of teaching kids things. Bit silly, I know, but you think about it seriously. There was a lot of positive messages being put out, and kids were sitting in on a after school, afternoon, evening, watching these shows, Saturday morning cartoons, Sunday morning, and they were learning things from them. They weren't just entertainment, they were packaged really well and really nicely, and that's why kids liked them. And they had good music, and you had fantastic action figures, so it went into a toy line, it carried on the kids' interest in the shows. You sometimes had it the opposite way round, where you'd have the toys released first, and then it'd be turned into a cartoon or some kind of feature. So it was absolutely massive back in the 80s and 90s. Some would even say like the late 70s, with shows like Ulysses. I didn't see that much of that because I was only born in 1980. So I only saw a few episodes. But again, that was a series with such a massive following, and amount of money gone into it, and amount of talent involved with the show. So it just shows you. But I mean, going back to Super Ted, I mean, you had Roy Kinnear, and one of the craziest things, they had Victor Spinetti playing Texas Pete. I mean, Victor Spinetti, the amount of work that he's been involved with over the years, and what a good name he's got in the industry, and he's playing a villain on a kid's cartoon called Texas Pete. But it just shows you people put their effort, their time, their talent into kids' TV back in those days, and it was seen as being very important, and as important as primetime TV, which I don't think it's nowhere near that these days, absolutely nowhere near it. And I don't think you get quite such big names involved in it anymore, and I don't think it's because they don't want to. I think it's because the quality work isn't out there. There's nothing for them to want to be involved with. So it's such a shame. It shows you, again, Super Ted, Sheila Steafile, been in loads of sci-fi. She's done things in Star Trek, she's done things in Battlestar Galactica, in Blake 7, in loads and loads of sci-fi. And she was involved in that in a kids' cartoon. Unbelievable. And they've got a producer called Mike Young, and Mike Young has done a hell of a lot of TV work, a lot of really good stuff, a lot of adult TV. But he jumped in to produce Super Ted because he thought it was a quality piece of work, and because the quality of the talent of the people that were involved with it, and the scripts were really good as well. So it just shows you these kids' TV shows really did get people that got quite big names that weren't obscure at all to come and work on them, and to make them the best that they could be. And had some absolutely fantastic shows. We really did, and I think we forget that sometimes. I don't think they're celebrated enough. I think a lot of people take the mick and say, oh, some of them were a bit camp or a bit over the top or a bit silly, and yeah, at times they were. But when you were, age 5 to sort of 13, that you enjoyed that, and I think people do forget how good the writing was on some of those shows and how good the music was. I mean, some of these actually had bands that were full-time bands providing theme songs for the shows. I mean, can you imagine somebody doing that now? I mean, you really can't. You can't imagine, like, I mean, it's a silly example, but you can't imagine someone like Ed Sheeran doing the theme song for a cartoon. It just wouldn't happen. But back then it did. They used to have big name bands would come and do theme tunes or outro tunes for the credits for these shows, because they were just taken much more seriously, and that they had a lot more money put into them. So yeah, I mean, also with Super Ted, you've got big names like Graham Bebbington, Christopher Plummer, were involved in series visual effects. I mean, that's just absolutely amazing, the big names that were involved. And then moving on in the list, we've got Mysterious Cities of Gold, which some would say, and I think probably quite rightly, that it was one of the best cartoons of all time, never mind the 80s. I mean, the amount of money that was spent into that, the mythos they created for the show, the amount of talented voice actors that were involved. I mean, you had Richard Dumont was playing Minotaur, the Olmec leader, who's gone on to do a lot of things since in TV and films and made a really big name for himself. Shiraz Adam, who played Esteban, has done a lot of film and TV, a lot of foreign cinema work. He's been in a few things that we would know over here in the UK, but he's done a lot of work in France and Germany and Australia. But he's a big actor now, he's doing a lot. And again, Shukai Levy doing the music, who's a very filmic composer. He's done a lot of music for films, and if you go onto anything like Wikipedia or IMDb and look at Shukai Levy, I mean, the list is just unbelievable for the things that he's done. And then you go into, we didn't just have cartoons back then, we had live features as well. One of the shows that I enjoyed, and you heard the theme tune back there, was Simon and the Witch. Now, it was a little bit tongue-in-cheek, it was a little bit camp at times, but it was written really, really well, and it was really fun, and it had a lot of heart. That was one of the things that I think a lot of these shows had in the 80s and 90s. We don't see so much now. There was a lot of nice kind of innocence, naivety, and heart that I think we're unfortunately missing these days. There's a lot of violence, there's a lot of negative vibes going about with a lot of these shows. They're very suspenseful. And there's certainly nothing like this for kids anymore. But you look at the people that was involved in Simon and the Witch, and you've got like Adam McInnes on series visual effects, who's done a lot of things. Elizabeth Spriggs, who played the witch. David Crane, who played Jimmy. Joan Sims from the Carry On films, that played Lady Fox Custard. Nicola Stapleton, who played Sally, who eventually ended up being in Biker Grove. I think she did a little role in Press Gang, Bad Girls, probably more recently in the late 90s. Coronation Street, and she did a lot of work. She was a young talent back in the day. Charles Pemberton, who played the mayor, has done a lot of work. Even going down to silly things like their costume designer, like Valerie Spooner, who's done loads of work on TV series and films, and I think she's even done a few episodes of Doctor Who. So I mean, it just shows you that like back in the day we had these amazing people working on these kids shows that were sometimes a little bit obscure, and not a lot of people knew about them, but because there were good ideas, and because the scripts were good, and because other good people were involved, it encouraged other talented writers and producers, actors, voice actors to get involved. I mean, another live feature that you go back to, this was probably more late 80s going into the 90s, was Nightmare. It's probably one of the best kids kind of adventure shows that there was, really, to be honest, with Hugo Myatt as Tregard. Was absolutely fantastic. You'd have a team of 3 or 4 kids would basically go into the castle set, and they would have to talk their 5th friend, who was the adventurer, to go round the maze of Nightmare, to go into the dungeoneer as he was called, and you had to walk around and interact with characters and pick up food and pick up objects, solve puzzles. It's almost like a computer game but live action, and you can imagine how exciting that was for kids watching it then, especially with it was the big golden age of computer games, and most kids were in the rooms playing games like day to day, and you had a game like this that made almost like a computer game, a live action feature. And it was just a really entertaining show. He had, again, lots of really good people, lots of good talent involved with it, and kids really enjoyed it. They really enjoyed it and took a lot out of it, and it did teach kids to, again, taught kids something. It taught kids to work together, not to be negative, not to give up. To work together to solve problems, to solve puzzles so they can move forward. And, they did that all without violence. There was never a Nightmare episode where, you had to kill something. You might use a magic spell to move them somewhere or something, but there wasn't any nastiness about it. Quite easily could have been, but with the setting, but yeah, there was no nastiness about it, and it was just such a nice, fun show. We haven't really got anything like that at all now, which is a real shame. And then you come back to shows that, again, a little bit later on in the 80s into the 90s, a very obscure show that I like called Mike and Angelo. You heard the theme song, was the last one on that run there. I mean, the big names you had involved with that: Tim Whitnall, Michael Benz, Matthew Wright. Unfortunately not from the same one as from the Wright stuff. I did check, that would have been quite funny, quite cool, but he's still a well-known actor, and he was in one of his main films that he was in that you probably know as High Spirits. So he was in that. You got John Lovett, Ron Moody, Fagin indeed, was in Mike and Angelo. Christopher Biggins, Christopher Ryan, who was in Santa Claus the movie, and The Young Ones, Alice in Wonderland, and they had Charles Warren as producer, who's a massive producer, who's done a lot of TV, a hell of a lot of TV. Again, if you go onto IMDb, go onto Wikipedia and look at the stuff that he's done, I mean, it's just absolutely unbelievable. And the list goes on, really. I mean, you talk about the great shows we had in the 80s and 90s. I'll run through a few of my favourites. A bit of a kind of spin-off, not quite connected, but almost a spin-off of the Muppets. Fraggle Rock, very good. Inspector Gadget, DuckTales, Danger Mouse. I mean, that had David Jason involved with it. I mean, at the time, even though it's going back a bit, he was still quite a big in-demand TV actor at that point. And he's doing a kids' cartoon, and probably when he initially did it, he thought, it's about a mouse and his friend going around solving crimes, sounds a bit odd, bit obscure. It might only do one series, but he did it because he wanted to do a kids show. He thought the scripts were pretty good, and he just thought that it would have a positive impact. So he did it again. Big talented people involved. D'Artagnan and the Three Muskehounds was a series with a massive scope, a lot of mythos. Again, a lot of very talented animators involved in the production. You've got Trapdoor, which was a bit of a silly show with plasticine models wandering around, but it had a good script and it was funny and a good theme song, and a good atmospheric feel to the show. So he just made it really good. Grange Hill was massive for years. Good old Todd Carty, Mark from EastEnders in it. Again, in that same vein, you've got Johnny Briggs, you've got Supergran, you've got Nightmare, which I've just mentioned, which are amazing live action features. Then you had things like the big classic, maybe for younger children, but Postman Pat, that was pretty good, when I was first growing up. The Raccoons, fantastic cartoon. I used to watch that every Saturday morning. The Raccoons and Gummy Bears, and I don't think they've had decent Saturday morning cartoons like that for a long time. And you've got to say, absolutely fantastic theme songs for both of those shows as well. The Raccoons and Gummy Bears, again, they had people writing the music that were at the very top of their game, and they've done a lot of stuff since, and they're actually full-time musicians. These are not people who've just come in as a one-off to do a kids show theme tune. They released a lot of these songs on their actual albums for their fans. So it's not just like they've just got somebody to do a kids TV theme, that's it. They were bands and artists in their own right. And then you go on to things like the Jetsons, Button Moon, who had a lot of very talented and very well known voice actors in it. Duckula, Garfield, Raggy Dolls, again, was another brilliant show with a lot of heart. People take the mick out of it a little bit now, but again, it kind of taught kids about if somebody was a little bit different, that you didn't disclude them, that you didn't bully them, that you didn't take the mick, that they had something to say and that they were just as important as you. And that was basically the message with Raggy Dolls. But there's a few people that could do with that message these days, isn't there? So I think it's really important, and I think people have underplayed what a negative effect it's had by the children's TV shows dropping in quality. And there isn't even really that many of them, and you can say, oh, there's a few, but they're not that good. There's just not that many kids shows for kids aged sort of 5 to 13, 14. There's a lot of preschool stuff and a lot of effort and money's put into that, but not for slightly older children. It's just a real shame. You go to things as well, such as Family Nest, another weekend cartoon. That was really good. Rainbow, which taught kids a lot of life lessons. People take the mick out of it and say it was a bit silly and a bit camp and a bit over the top. But again, good characters, good scripts, funny. Had a lot of talented people working in it. Had Roy Skelton doing the voice of Zippy, who did a hell of a lot of TV shows, children and adult. He's a very well known, very well respected voice actor, and he's involved in that. So you just see again and again, there's just really good people taking part in these shows that were made in the 80s and 90s, and bands working on these shows as well that could have destroyed their careers, but they believed in the production, so they took part. Going back later into the 80s, you've got like Jason the Wheeled Warriors, again another brilliant theme tune, another well scripted series with its own mythos of its own, really good scripts, really good story, really strong characters. You got things like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Obviously a lot of the time these days it gets marked down as Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles, but it's not, it's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, we all know that. Then got programs like Rent-A-Ghost and like Thomas the Tank Engine, which were massive as well. It's just absolutely unbelievable when you actually go through some of these shows that there was. And then you go into the 90s. Some of the ones that you can talk about there that were really good: Animaniacs, Rugrats. That was absolutely massive for years and years and years, and had a lot of talented people working on it. There's actually quite a few people that worked on that have gone on to work with Seth MacFarlane on Family Guy, and you can kind of see the kind of similar themes. You can kind of understand how they moved across from that to that. But another great show, Darkwing Duck, Rocko's Modern Life, Boy Meets World. Got things like the Batman animated series. You've got Ren and Stimpy, Pinky and the Brain, Clarissa Explains It All, which a lot of girls liked a lot. DuckTales, and you've also got Power Rangers, of course, which was reasonably good. Tasmania, you've got the X-Men series, the Tiny Toon Adventures, Sabrina the Teenage Witch, Winnie the Pooh, Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers, Captain Planet and the Planeteers. I mean, it's just absolutely unbelievable when you start going through some of these shows. I mean, even something like Defenders of the Earth. I mean, that again was another one with a lot of mythos. It was almost like, the amount of effort that was put into it. It's almost like what you'd expect in a DC and Marvel film these days. It was just unbelievable, and great theme song on that as well. So I think pretty much that covers most of what I wanted to talk about in terms of the children's television programming from the 80s and the 90s. And I think I've discussed a few of the shows that I really enjoyed and why I enjoyed them and why I think that they made their mark, an indelible mark on a lot of people who were growing up with those shows back in that time. And I think it probably goes, from people that were born in the mid to late 70s right up to the mid to late 90s, when I think it was probably mid to late 90s when it started to wane a little bit and we started to lose the quality right in. I think a lot of the people that had worked as like head of departments in like children's programming seemed to move on to other things, which they were going to because they were very talented people. And as I say, you look at some of the people that worked on these shows and what they're doing now, it's absolutely unbelievable how far they've come. But then again, you can understand why, because they made really good shows, and they made shows with mythoses that you could look back on and see how these characters got to that point and where they came from originally, and everything was mapped out. It was like a proper adult TV series, or even onto the scope of a feature film sometimes. So it's just absolutely amazing when you look back on it, and it is such a shame, like I say, since the late 90s, that a lot of those people moved on. People didn't come in to replace them. Budgets for children's television were absolutely cut to the bottom, to the ground, basically. They would drop massively, and so there isn't the money being spent on children's TV programming now, and there hasn't been for a long while. And I don't think people probably put too much earnest on it these days. I don't think people in control of the BBC or ITV or any of the cable or Sky networks, I don't think they really see how important those types of TV shows can be for children in the formative years, like I say, between the age of sort of 4 or 5 up to the age of sort of 13, 14. Those kids need good programming. They need some good life lessons. And for me, it doesn't matter if it comes in a cartoon. If it's packaged the right way, it's sold the right way, and it's got the right message that comes from the heart, that teaches them right and wrong, that teaches them how to treat other people properly and to treat people with respect and treat their elders with respect, treat the world and the environment around them with respect, and not to put too much earnest on technology and to learn how to do things properly in the real world. I think those are all really important things, and I think we've lost that. We've lost our track completely on that, and I just think that's such a shame. And I think that's why it should perhaps come as no surprise that there's a lot of young people that are struggling these days to sort of understand the world and the world around them, because we used to have those shows in the 80s and 90s that used to give you those life lessons, and that used to say, here's a character that has got this issue, and you'd be able to relate to them and see how they got through it. It would help you get through your issues, and I don't think we've got that for children now, and it's such a shame. As I've said, I just think it's a really negative thing, and it's something that it'd be quite nice if they could go back and see how important those shows were back in the day, and start getting some programming for some younger people going again, and putting the money into it and getting good talent involved with it, and also people that have got these really good ideas that are being ignored at the moment, get them on board, make a pilot, see what it's like. If somebody's got a really good idea with some strong characters and a really good mythos and a backstory that can be built upon, and there can maybe be toys and associated things for kids to play with and enjoy that are associated with the shows, why not? Everybody wins. Even if you look at it from a money point of view, people make money from that, and kids will enjoy the shows and enjoy the toys, and as an added bonus, if it makes them better as people or gives them some life lessons or helps them with issues that they're trying to overcome, then that's no bad thing at all. And I think it's something that we need to be thinking about. I really do. I think that's it from me. I think from where we're going to finish at this point is I think we're just going to have a few theme tunes, some of my favourites from back in the day, from 80s, 90s kids TV. I'll just play some of the themes for you, just a bit of an outro, and hopefully there's some in there that you'll remember and you really enjoyed as well. Okay, we'll see you next time. Enjoy. Bye.
Somewhere in the future, follow what we did. Trouble is waiting on the last frontier. Into these worlds of unknown.
stop it by finding the lost 13 treasures of rule. At his side is an unlikely but loyal crew of misfits. At his back, the evil pirate lord Blood, who will stop at nothing to get the treasures for himself. It's high adventure with the Pirates of Dark Water. Thundering across the stars to save the universe from the monster minds. Jace searches for his father to unite the magic root and lead his lightning league to victory over the changing form of Sawboss. Wheeled warriors explode into battle. Lightning strikes.
There's a power that comes from deep inside of you. 'Cause every day you're reaching toward the light. And you know there's a long, long way ahead of you. But when your wills get you there, things will turn out right. Just keep on turning, don't stop moving. The fire is on. We're burning, the pumps burning, our wheels moving, we'll go again. Just keep on turning, don't stop moving. The fire is on. The pumps burning, our wheels moving, we'll go Dance your cares away. Worries for another day. Let the music play. Down back rock. Work your cares away. Dancing's for another day. Let the Fraggles play. We're go bogey. Hey, look, Ma! I caught a fuego! Dance your cares away. Worries for another day. Let the music play. Down in Fraggle Rock. Down in Fraggle Rock.
Down at Fraggle Rock.
Hey, look! A Dungeons and Dragons ride! Wow, neat!
Give me a break.
I don't like this! Whoa! What's happening? Where are we? Look out!
Fear not, Ranger. Barbarian, magician, thief, cavalier, and acrobat.
Who was that?
That was Venger, the force of evil. I am Dungeon Master, your guide in the realm of Dungeons and Dragons.
Somewhere in the dark and nasty regions where nobody goes stands an ancient castle. is something down there.